Non-player character encounters and stat blocks in Cypher are a lot different than in some more mechanic-heavy RPGs, so let's go through what you can expect with them. The main form of initiative in Cypher for encounters is pretty straightforward. The NPC's initiative is based on their level, maybe possibly modified level, but we'll get to that in a second. The players then just roll a task, usually a speed task, to determine what the difficulty they beat in the initiative order. They may have training or assets in an actual initiative skill, which can modify the tasks involved. Characters that beat the same difficulty can usually choose among themselves which go first. As of recording this video, the Cypher setting book of Horus is not yet out, so I can't explain much about it, but in that book there are some reworking and retooling of a few systems within Cypher, one of which is the initiative system. Horus is going to implement an initiative-free system where players can try to coordinate when they act while still making use of an initiative task in some way. This helps to blend combat and non-combat together so there isn't that hard stop of play that separates most RPGs into two different sections. Let's get into the stat blocks of creatures. First of all, unlike games like Dungeons & Dragons, I'm only going to refer to them as NPC stat blocks. Because of the narrative nature of Cypher, you never know when an encounter could be handled via skills or peaceful means. So let's go over the two styles of stat blocks you're likely to find in this game. Firstly is the main stat block you're likely to find in a separate bestiary section of a book. In this case, we'll look at the classic dragon and how it's handled in the main rulebook on page 325. The first part you'll usually see is the title bar. In this, you get two pieces of information: the name and the level/target number of the creature. The level/target number is the most important piece of information in any stat block. This is the target the players need to roll against for any sort of task: social, attack, defense, you name it. This is the base number they'll likely need to worry about. Thus, even though this is probably one of the simplest parts of the stat block, the title bar may be the most important of all. Theoretically, once you learn how the health is calculated, all you really need to make an NPC is a name and a number. Next, we get to the descriptive information. This starts with one or more paragraphs actually making a description of the creature. Although not required, it's always nice to have a bit of a text description of its personality, habits, maybe physical description as well. Things the group can use and play off of. Next, we have the motive. This is a very simple statement, ranging from a few words to an entire sentence. One of the more common ones you'll see is "hungers for flesh," which is used for a variety of the more bestial creatures you can encounter, although in some cases, like the dragon for example, it could even be unintelligent, albeit somewhat monstrous entities. After the motive, we have environment. Because Cypher is such an open-ended game that can be used for basically anything, you will often see this to help narrow down where a creature is more likely to be found, or maybe the theme that it fits within. Next, we move on to the actual system mechanics for the creature, which comes in a couple of parts. Firstly, we have a few spots for some numerical values that we need to know: health, damage, and armor. Depending on the specific creature, this can vary on what the creature's designed around. However, if you aren't sure what these numbers should be, or maybe they aren't listed, which is rare but it does happen, then remember that health is often 3 times their level and damage is usually equal to their level. Next, we have the movement of the entity. The majority of NPCs have a movement of short, although obviously there are some that have other distances or even multiple modes of travel with various distances in them. Example is this dragon that is short on foot but long distance while flying. Next are the modifications. Very simply, the modifications are certain circumstances where the creature may be treated as a different level than its base level. In the case of the dragon here, you can see it's good at perception and riddles, but due to its size, is very bad at its speed defense. Not all NPCs have modifications, but it is a great way to show what they excel at and what they're inefficient at as well. Next, we have the combat information. This is a description of all that the creature is capable of in combat. In most publications of Monte Cook games, this is written in a descriptive manner to explain not only what the creature can do, but sometimes why. After all, this system is usually aiming for a more narrative style of play. The combat information usually gives a mixture of abilities, attacks, and combat notes for the GM to keep track of. Finally, we get to the sections that are more like tips for running the creature for the GM. This is split into several parts, some of which you don't always see in every stat block. Firstly is the interaction section. This is a general attitude of the creature if the players attempt to interact with it in a non-combat manner, although there are plenty of creatures whose interaction would simply be it's aggressive and will attack. The majority of entities likely have a more complex interaction in the game. A human sniper is still a complex person with hopes and goals. A hungry bear still has a sense of self-preservation as well as the care of its family or territory. Next is the use. This is almost like the big tip for the GM on when and how to use the creature effectively in the game. Useful if you aren't sure what you wish to do with this particular entity. Next is a part that you only occasionally see, and that's the loot. Not all stat blocks will have it, and even if it does, remember that everything in Cypher is optional. Loot is just that. Items, treasure, ciphers, etc. Things that you may find on or around the creature and its area. Finally, you find the GM intrusions. These are usually in the side stat blocks, although that can change depending on the book that you're in. There may be one or more here for the GMs to use while playing this entity. I consider this another one of the really important bits of the stat block. This gives you example intrusions that are tailor-made for these particular entities. Great for those times when you're having a hard time thinking of your own. There are also other times when you may find stat blocks so easy and so simple that they're almost a side note. Here's an example from the Stars Are Fire with the 11th Reich Soldier on page 21. You'll notice the stat block is tiny, just in that off notes section on the side. With only the most minimal of information, it has a name and a level because those are the important bits. It also has armor, because there's no default armor rating by level, so it's good to know if they have it. And it has a short attack description to let you know it's at range, and it has a higher than the default damage. You notice it doesn't list health, which means you can assume the health is the default of 3 times its level. In this case, the soldier's health would be 9. Encounter design in Cypher is both much simpler but much more free form than a crunchier system like D&D or Pathfinder. There's no surefire mathematical formula to tell you what number of what level creatures a group should face on what number of tier, especially since the individual characters may advance at different rates, and combat in Cypher may involve actions and intents that are not so clear-cut. After all, in a system where the role to stab someone in the nostril with a dagger is very similar to demoralizing them by telling them they smell funny, players can be very creative with how they tackle all situations, not just combat. This is even more important to keep in mind due to the fact that combat is not a focus in Cypher. Combat does not improve characters in any way. XP is not usually given for combat. In fact, sometimes the quickest way to advance the story and earn rewards is to find ways around combat entirely. If you really need some numbers to help guide you, just remember the challenge difficulty table. A difficulty of 3 means that without any training, applied effort, assets, or abilities, a player can succeed on that task about half the time. Also, it's important not to negate any advancements the characters get. A werewolf that was frightfully challenging in session 1 is going to be easier as the characters advance in capability. That's okay. That's by design. Just because their abilities increase doesn't mean the challenges around them do. An intimidating challenge, which is difficulty 6 when the characters are tier 1, is still a difficulty 6 at tier 5. Because they've found ways to overcome that challenge with effort, abilities, and skill. This is why it's important to have more pots on the stove. I've gone over this in other videos about encounter design in a more system-agnostic way, but having hazards, other tasks, environmental effects, and more is how you make these action sequences unique and interesting. Finally, I'm going to reiterate in this Cypher video something I said in my system-agnostic video on situations as antagonists. Link will be in the description below. In that video, I gave examples on how to give an entire situation its own stat block and how to use things like skills as attacks. In it, I even explained specifically how I did it in a Numenera scene that I ran that involved players racing through the cloud crystal sky fields as giant crystals plummeted from the sky. I explained how I can use skills, sort of like attacks, against these situations' health. The skills in this case did different damages depending on how well they were trained in the skill, they had an inability, practiced, training, specialized, etc. By allowing them to harm the presence of the situation, almost like it would be like a combat, I can do large scale sort of situations, like the crystals falling, or escaping from an exploding base, maybe weaving through the battlefield of two oncoming armies clashing against each other. You can use this type of custom thing for any sort of large scale scenario where the players aren't dealing with a specific singular entity. Once again, this is something I'm going to be expanding upon more within the Aura's book, so I'm only going to give some details about that here. Basically, the fact that I could use the different levels as different amounts. We'll go into that more once the Aura's book is released, but I do have a better subsystem for this. So in conclusion, I think this has sort of gotten us a good baseline. There's always more to talk about whenever we cover any subject within Cypher, but I think this gets us a good starting point for both making encounters and the stat blocks of the creatures within them. I don't want to go into too many specific details about this because I want to keep these videos relatively short-ish. If you have any other questions or comments about creating encounters within the Cypher system, leave them in the comments down below. I'm more than happy to answer them as need be. And as always, stay healthy, stay safe, and have a good one, eh?